Okay, now I think, someone give me a thumbs up if they can see this again? Great, thank you. I'm not as much, even after a year, somehow I'm not as much as a whiz at all of the Zoom and Facebook technology as I sometimes think I am. So thank you everyone for being here. Uh, and this will be in lieu of my Shabbat HaGadol Drasha this year. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do this in person on Shabbat HaGadol. The Vilna Gaon had a lot of, who lived in the late 18th, early 19th century, and many unique practices based on his understanding and his reading of the Gemara. And in a work called Maseh Harav, the ways of the rabbi, or Maseh Rav, one of his students wrote down a number of these practices. So let's see how he describes what the Vilna Gaon would do at the Seder. And he writes that they then bring in the Seder plate with two matzahs, which are covered, and on the plate is also found maror, haroset, the shank bone, and the egg. And they break one matzah and hide half of that matzah to serve as the afikomen. And they're left with one whole matzah, one broken matzah. And the broken matzah is put at the top, and the full one, the complete one, under the broken one, and the shank bone, the egg below the whole matzah, and the maror and the haroset on top. And the head of the household says halach manya, and those who are present listen to him read the Haggadah. This is a little illustration we have here of what the Vilna Gaon Seder plate looked like. And there's a lot we could talk about. His Seder plate obviously looks different than ours, but what I want to focus on is why only two matzahs. Because I think that is the first thing that should jump out at us when we read this. We, of course, don't use two matzahs. We use three matzahs. So why did the Vilna Gaon think that one should only have two matzahs at the Seder? And the Vilna Gaon is not the only authority that feels that we should have two matzahs at the Seder. The Rambam actually says something quite similar. So the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, where he talks about in the Hilchot Chametz Matzah, where he talks about Pesach, he describes the order of the Seder, and he writes, afterwards, he recites the blessing, Al Natilat Yadayim, and washes his hand the second time. Right, the first time was by Karpas, so this is the second time you're washing. For he diverted his attention from his hands during the time he was reciting the Haggadah. He takes two cakes, two matzot, divides one of them places the broken half inside the whole one, and then recites Hamotzi Lechem and Haaretz. Why doesn't he recite Hamotzi on two matzahs, as on other festivals, the Rambam asks? Because it says in Dvarim that matzah is Lechem One. That matzah is the bread of poverty, is the way it's translated here, or the bread of the poor. And the Rambam writes, just as a poor person is accustomed to eating only a broken piece of bread or matzah, so too we should use a broken matzah and not have two complete matzahs for Lechem Mishnah, as we do on Shabbos or on other Hagim. So that's why the Rambam says you only use two matzahs, and that's why the Gra says that you only use two matzahs as well. And there's something else, of course, about this Rambam that might surprise us, which is the way he describes, which is what he actually does with his two matzahs. Right? The Gra said you break one in half, you put the broken one, you hide half for the afikomen, you put what's left of the fragment that's left on top of the whole matzah, and then you conduct your Seder. And that's it's different than what we do, but it sounds like the Gra's matzah was very similar to ours, if not identical. The Rambam, though, does something very strange with the broken half. He wraps it places it inside the whole matzah. And that's because the Rambam's matzah was different than ours, and some Sephardic communities still have matzah like this. Their matzah was much more like a lafa. It's soft. As opposed to ours, Ashkenazim have the custom to make matzah as thin as possible, which is why we end up with much more of like this cracker type matzah than what the Rambam obviously used. To use something much more like a lafa. So let's explore this whole idea of lechem oni a little bit more. how do we know that matzah is supposed to be lechem oni? It says it in the Chumash, in the Torah, so that's a good place to start. But what does the Gemara have to say about that? So the Gemara in Pesachim records an argument about what exactly lechem oni means in terms of the Seder. So Shmuel says that the phrase lechem oni, bread of the poor, bread of affliction, means that it's lechem onim, that it's bread over which one answers or discusses things. And that's why, so it has to be there when we recite the HaGadol. Those are the matters that we're discussing, and that's what lechem oni refers to. That was also taught in a Braita, that lechem oni is bread over which one answers many matters. So that's opinion one. That doesn't actually sound like the Rambam or the Gra. Alternatively, another answer is provided, that lechem oni is actually written without a vav, which means a poor person. And just as it is the manner of a poor person to eat a piece of bread and not the entire loaf, so to here, one shouldn't use a complete matzah at the Seder, that one should only use a piece of it. And a third option is presented. Alternatively, just as it is the manner of a poor person that he heats the oven and his wife bakes quickly before the small amount of wood that they have is used up, so too here, when baking matzah, he heats the oven and his wife bakes the dough very quickly so it doesn't rise. So according to the third opinion, the very fact that matzah is unleavened is a sign of it being lechem oni, right? It's a sign of that. That's how one who is poor, who doesn't have a lot of means, they're not able to afford enough fuel for their fire, enough wood in this case, but enough fuel for their oven, their stove, to allow something to cook fully and rise, and that's why it's called. That's why it's referred to as lechem oni. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch lived in Germany in the 19th century. He focuses really on this notion of lechem oni as being about the bread of the poor. And he writes in his commentary on the Chumash that lechem oni is bread of dependence, is how he translates it. For this, he says, is the real concept of what it means to be an ani, a poor person. And so is the most striking characterization of the meaning of the mitzvah. That lechem oni, when we eat lechem oni, when we eat matzah, we're really supposed to feel a sense of dependence, a lacking, that we're not able to fully provide or fully have everything that we need. And the Rambam actually did one other thing that was different from, the Rambam also, I should say, it's not just one other thing. His Haggadah, at least the way it's presented in the Mishnah Torah, is also quite different from what we do at the Seder. And he also doesn't have yachatz, that breaking of the matzah at the beginning of towards the beginning of the Haggadah in the same way we do. And that we'll see in a moment why that's the case, but he does do something else that's quite striking, and I think really reflects this notion of lechem oni as being, and matzah as being about a sense of dependence. So he writes that one should make changes on this night, and this is something that we do in some fashion. We make changes on this night so the children will see and they'll ask, why is this night different from all other nights? And then the leader of the Seder will reply to them, this and this occurred and this took place, right? They'll tell them the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, or what changes should be made. So he suggests a few changes, that you should give the children roasted seeds and nuts, and write some sweets to keep them interested and wondering what's going on. And the table should be taken away from them. So before they ate, apparently people sort of had small tables of food that were out in front of them. So you should pull them away from the kids to keep them wondering what's happening. And then he says, and the matzot should be snatched from each other and the like, that you should pass the matzahs around or grab them from each other. And I think this also reflects this idea of lechem oni as being about poor, as being about, and a sense of dependence, that you have to take your matzah physically, the Rambam is saying, from someone else. It's not enough to take it off from the table where it's presented in a nice fashion. Instead, it should be this sense that you're receiving something, you're receiving your sustenance from someone else. And that's also the fashion, of course, in which a poor person eats. And this sense that we're reenacting or trying to really recreate the sense of what it means to be an ani, what it means to be a poor person, that matzah's lechem onei, that I think is really paramount for the Rambam. And that's also why the Rambam doesn't have yachatz as we do. He doesn't break the matzah at the very beginning, towards the beginning of the Seder. Instead, he does it only right before he's about to make motzei. As the Haggadah Hagirshuni, a contemporary commentary on the Haggadah, points out, that the Rambam believes that one uses a whole matzah and a fragment, and not two complete matzahs as we do, and a fragment, because a poor person only has fragments of matzah when he makes motzei. And since this is the case, one should not break the matzah until immediately before making hamotzei, because one is only breaking the matzah then so that they can act in the manner of one who is poor, so that they can reenact or enact that experience for themselves of what it means to be poor and lacking. And Rav Soloveitchik points out perhaps why this is so important for the Rambam, that one really enact what it means to be a poor person and to be dependent for your sustenance at the Seder. So Rav Soloveitchik writes that the standard text that, and we're probably all familiar with this, it appears in the Mishnah, appears elsewhere, appears in the Haggadah. The standard text of the Mishnah reads, in each generation, one is duty-bound to lirot et atzmo, to consider himself as if he had been delivered from Mitzrayim, as if he'd been delivered from Egyptian bondage. But instead of the reflexive verb lirot et atzmo, signifying an inner experience, the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah substitutes the verb laharot et atzmo. So the Rambam doesn't say that you're supposed to consider yourself, one's supposed to consider themselves in sort of an inner way or in an intellectual way. Instead, he says you're supposed to demonstrate, to behave in a manner manifesting the experience of finding liberty after having been enslaved for a long time. So the Rambam and the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, for them, what's paramount is reenacting this experience of being poor, of lacking, of feeling like we don't have enough. And that's what matzah represents. And that's why we can't have lechem mishnah as we normally do. We can't have two whole loaves or two whole matzot. Instead, we have 1.5, which does sort of, and the Rambam and the Gra points out that if we did what we normally do and have two whole matzot, that would be quite strange. And he writes that using only 2 matzot makes the most sense, because this is implied by the meaning of the phrase lechem oni, bread of the poor, bread of affliction. For were this not so, it would not be the way of the poor to have 2 matzot plus another half, which is what we do. And the Vilna Gaon says that has nothing to do with eating like the poor person, with eating like one who's oppressed, one who's afflicted, one who's enslaved. Then you would actually be adding on much more than they have, which raises a question. If matzah is lechem onei, and we want to be reenacting and creating for ourselves that sense of lacking, why is it that we do something so different from the Rambam and the Vilna Gaon? Why do we use 3 matzahs? So to understand that, let's take a step back and think about why we have a focus, why on a normal yontif we have lechem mishnah, we make motzi on 2 challahs at all. We know why we do it on Shabbos, because the Torah tells us that no man fell on Shabbos, so there was a double portion that fell on Erev Shabbos, on Friday. But it actually doesn't, the Torah never explicitly tells us that on Yontif, Erev Yontif, there was anything like this. So why do we have a focus on lechem mishnah, on having two loaves of challah, or perhaps 2 complete matzot at all? So the Torah tells us that 6 days you shall gather it, referring to the man, and on the 7th day, Yom HaShvi, that is Shabbat, and it says lo yehi bo, there will be not. So there's a midrash that points out there's something redundant here, because at the beginning of this pasuk, it said that 6 days you'll gather it. So it's already telling us that on Shabbat there won't be man. And then at the end of the pasuk, it also tells us that on Shabbat there won't be any man for you to collect. Right? So the midrash says 6 days shall you gather it. we are hereby apprised that manna does not descend on Shabbos, and hence do we derive that the same was also true on Yantif from the superfluous phrase at the end that on Shabbos there will not be any man. And the Midrash goes on to point about how we know about Yom Kippur. But that's how we derive that also on Yantif, man didn't fall, and that's why we need Lechem Mishnah also on a normal Yantif. So obviously, though, our practice comes from somewhere, right? We don't do what the Rambam and the Gra do. So why is it that despite the fact that matzah is lechem oni, it's bread of the poor, it's bread of the afflicted, that we use we start with 3 matzahs, and then we end up when we make motzi, when we're eating, unlike the way the Rambam and the Gra described experiencing what it means to be, or enacting what it means to be poor and lacking, why is it that we have 2.5 matzahs in front of us at that moment? Rashi, just on the Gemara that we read before, on the Gemara Msachem, says, so too here a piece. Just like a poor person only eats fragments of bread, fragments of matzah, the Gemara said, so too we use a fragment of a matzah. And Rashi writes that this is for the blessing on the mitzvah of eating matzah. We see 2 brachot, one after the other at the Seder. We say, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and then we say, al achilat matzah, one right after the other. So Rashi says that fragment is there for that second bracha, for that when we say al achilat matzah, for the mitzvah of eating matzah. But one needs 2 whole matzahs for hamotzi, because we don't want this holiday, we don't want Pesach to be any less or to be degraded in some way than the other holidays when one is required to use 2 loaves for hamotzi. And then Rashi says, when you eat, you break one of the whole ones for eating the matzah. And what Rashi is also telling us here is that having Lechem Mishnah, having 2 loaves, is really an aspect of Simchas Yantif. It's part of rejoicing on Yantif. And we don't want our joy on Pesach to be any less than our joy on any of the other Hagim. We don't want anything to be taken away from our fully experiencing the holiday of Pesach, just like we experience every other Yantif. And Rabbi Ezra Bick, who teaches at Yeshivat Har Etzion in Alon Shvut in Israel, explains Rashi in an interesting way that I want us to look at. So he writes that the al achilat matzah relates to whatever matzah he will subsequently eat. And it's necessary that there be a broken matzah before him, as this adds meaning to the blessing. Since matzah for Pesach is lechem oni, it's poor man's bread. Rashi believes that the broken matzah, by being present when the blessing is recited, provides a context for what it means to be poor. And you look at the broken fragment and you say, okay, this is how this is what the table of one who is poor looks like, that they don't have a complete loaf, which is an integral part of the meaning of the mitzvah of matzah. But once that context is provided and institutionalized in the blessing, the mitzvah is fulfilled by eating any matzah. So you look at the broken fragment, you look at that half piece, but you actually don't have to eat it. Since the breaking of bread on a festival needs to be with, or when you make hamotzi for the brachot of bread on a festival needs to be with whole unbroken loaves. The hamotzi and subsequent eating is done only with the whole ones. This is really what Rashi is saying. So for Rashi, it's not about recreating or reenacting the experience of being a poor person at all. It's about having a symbol in some sort of intellectual way. This is what a poor person's table looks like. They only have a fragment of matzah on their Seder plate. They don't have, or on their table, they don't have whole loaves. But once you have that symbol there, and and intellectually you know that we were once slaves in Egypt and we once didn't have enough to eat. But you put that symbol there, it's on your table, it provides a context, like other symbols we have on the Seder plate. Then you go ahead and you have hamotzi, then you go ahead and you eat the full matzahs. You don't even have to eat the broken fragment because you're not reenacting something. You're reminding yourself of something, but the experience is not a visceral one. It's an intellectual one. This happened once, it's there, I'm going to put it maybe off to the side a little bit, and now I'm going to really enjoy my Yontif meal in the way I would enjoy any Yontif meal. And this machlokus that we see, this dispute that I think we see between Rashi on the one hand, who sees the experience of what we're trying to do at the Seder with matzah's lechamoni, matzah's bread of the poor, as being one that's sort of more intellectual and less experiential, versus the Rambam and the Vilna Gaon, who see it as having to be a visceral, experiential process where we reenact what it means to be a poor person, to be someone who's lacking, is also goes back to dispute about Lechem Mishnah on Shabbos as well. So let's take a look briefly. We'll go on a very quick tangent, and then we'll wrap things up with where we are today and why and what exactly it is that we do, and why we do it. So the Gemara in Shabbos says that Rabbi Abba said on Shabbat a person is obligated to break, is really the way you would translate liftzoa, over 2 loaves of bread, as it's written, and it happened on the 6th day that they collected Lechem Mishnah. So Rashi there translates the word liftzoa, to break, as birkat. He writes it's birkat hamotze. It means to use for motze. So the Gemara said that it sounds like you're breaking 2 loaves. Rashi says you just have to have them on the table when you make, you have to have 2 loaves next to each other when you make motze, but you only actually have to cut one. The Gra, the Vilna Gaon, writes, though, that the essential aspect, as it was stated by Rav Shlomo Luria and the Shnei Luchot Abrit, another early authority who lived in the 16th century, is to cut 2 loaves at every meal, like the Rashba, or another a Rishon says. So for Rashi describes what we do on Shabbos, I think what all of us probably do on Shabbos, which is that when we come to make motzi, we have 2 challahs in front of us, we make motzi, we put one on the side, and we cut one, and we might even reuse that one we never touched, we might even reuse at lunch, right, or at Shalosh Shidduchos when it comes to making motzi again. The Gra is saying, though, that no, you have to cut into and eat from 2 different challahs on Shabbos. So for Rashi, the second challah is a symbol of the fact that the Jewish people gathered a double portion on Erev Shabbos. So they gathered a double portion of the man. For the Vilna Gaon, this has to be experienced. We have to experience what it meant. Just as the Jewish people had double on Shabbos, we also have to experience what it means to have double on Shabbos. So Rashi has this approach that seems to be more intellectual and more symbolic. And the Vilna Gaon and the Rambam have an approach that is much more visceral, experiential, and about enacting something. So how do we get to where we end up? Let's take a look at this Gemara in Brachot, and then we'll take a look at what Tosfot, another medieval commentator, has to say. So the Gemara in Brachot says, Rav Papa said, everyone agrees that while fulfilling the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach, one places the piece inside the hole and breaks it. So apparently it seems like their matzah also might have been more like the Rambam's matzah, right? We can't place pieces inside our matzahs, but the Rambam could. What's the reason? With regard to matzah, the phrase lechem oni, bread of affliction, is written. And the poor typically eat their bread in pieces, and therefore eating matzah on Pesach, the broken matzah, is also significant. Rabbi Abba said, and on Shabbos one is obligated to break bread for the meal over 2 loaves, or to have 2 loaves, right? We saw that there's a dispute over what liftzoa, that word break, really means. And what is the reason? Because the Torah that discusses gathering man on Friday for Shabbos uses the phrase lechem mishnah, twice as much bread. Tosfot there describes a practice that is more akin to what we do. He says, because the Torah writes lechem oni, one places the broken matzah underneath the complete one, giving the impression that one is making hamotzi on them both. Nevertheless, one blesses on the complete one, and over the broken one, you then recite al achilat matzah before making a sandwich and eating them together. And this is the accepted minhag. This is the accepted practice. And the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, writes that he will take the matzot as they have been set with a broken one between the two whole matzot, and he will hold them and recite the blessing of hamotzi and al achilat matzah. And afterwards, he will break pieces from the top whole matzah and the broken one and eat them together, a kazayit from each, about olive size, from each simultaneously. So what Tosfot and then what the Shulchan Aruch are telling us is that you hold up, you have your 2.5 matzahs, your broken one is hidden in the middle, and you recite hamotzi on them both. Then it seems like some people actually have the practice of dropping the third matzah before they say al achilat matzah, the next bracha. But you should eat a whole matzah and the broken one simultaneously at the same time. And according to Tosfot, it's important that that broken fragment is also there when we say hamotzi, that it adds something to our experience of Pesach, of what it means for matzah to be lechem oni, even though you still need 2 whole matzahs for lechem mishnah and to fully celebrate Pesach as a yom tov. So now we have 3 opinions. On the one hand, we have the Rambam and the Vilna Gaon, who have a sense that we're reenacting what it means to be poor. On the other hand, we have Rashi, for whom this isn't a reenacting, this is an intellectual reminder and symbolic. And that's why you don't even need to eat the fragment. And Tosafot, though, which is the basis for our practice, brings it together. That we have lechem mishnah, we have 2 whole matzahs, but we also have to have and eat that fragment. And that fragment has to be there even as we make hamotzi. And I actually think that these 3 opinions really reflect 3 different ways of dealing with suffering, tragedy, and loss, and history. Because of course, that's what the Seder is all about. And matzah, certainly, as lechem oni, is supposed to be a reminder of hardship that the Jewish people and that the Jewish people went through, that we have gone through as we went out from Mitzrayim, as we went out from Egypt. And we probably can think of people in their lives who fall into these different categories in terms of how they relate to things that have happened in the past. There are people for whom, after they go through something, a loss, they suffer something, they carry it with them in such a way that no matter what they're doing, no matter what experience they're having, no matter how joyful it might be, it's there and it shapes that experience. It takes away from their joy. And by not having lechem mishnah at the Seder, which of course, according to the Rambam and the Vilna Gaon, is a joyous meal, but by not having lechem mishnah, our joy is in some way diminished. It's not as full as it could be, because lechem oni is a sign of suffering, right? And when we eat it in the way of a poor person, we're really reenacting that suffering. That loss, even in a joyful moment for some people, a sense of loss will always transform and diminish a joy that they have. And then there are others for who experience a loss or experience a hardship, and there are they know it's there, but they put it off to there's a side. They intellectualize it, maybe they push it away, and it sits there in a corner of their mind, never and it doesn't really change their experience of anything in life. That they go on almost as it were just as they did before whatever it was that they went through. And then there are those who are able to really integrate what they went through into whatever experience that they're having, to whatever joy they have in the future, that their loss, their hardship, it stays with them, and it's part of who they are. It changes how they experience the world, but it doesn't reduce or diminish their capacity to experience joy and to build in the future. And I think over the last year, we all have gone through a level of hardship. Each of us has experienced it differently, but it's been a challenge for all of us in different ways. And some of us might carry that year with them in a way that it will always be there. And depending on how the magnitude of what the losses one experience, perhaps people will struggle not to allow what happened to diminish what they do in the future, or the joy they experience in the future. And other people, they're going to try not to acknowledge even the hardship and this really unique, maybe even, I don't know, unparalleled, but truly challenging year that we've been through. They're going to try to pretend it never happened, it wasn't such a big deal. It's pushed off to a corner in a symbolic way. Yeah, we remember when, but it doesn't really change or transform who they are in any way. And then I think what I hope though, and what I think the way we should deal with experiences of hardship or loss in our lives is this model that Tosfot presents for us, which is of course the custom that we use at the Seder. And that is that we take that broken piece, we take that fragment, we take that lechem oni, that sense of loss and affliction and dependence, and we have it in the midst of the fullness of our joy. So it transforms the way we eat the matzah, it transforms the way we eat. We don't eat 2 whole loaves the way we do on other hagim, but it also doesn't diminish it. And that I hope that for all of us, the experience of what we've gone through over the past year, and I really do believe, God willing, that there's a light at the end of the tunnel that we're getting closer and closer to. But I hope that this experience never takes away from our joy in the future. I hope we don't ignore it either. I hope it transforms who we are, and we're able to really carry it with us and continue to appreciate everything we have in life, but also remember the ways in which we've been changed by it. And I wish each and every one of you a Hag Kasher V'Sameach. And I will go ahead and also unmute people, and if people have any questions. Okay, anyone have any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I really enjoyed that piece about the lechem oni part. You know, there's so many different ways to understand that half of that matzah. I really enjoyed that.
Greetings from the great state of New York. Yasher Koach, Rabbi Noah. Really enjoyed this year.
And if people have any other Pesach questions, feel free to reach out to me, email me, call me. I'm around anytime to answer those. And also, if you haven't yet sent in your Mechirat Chametz form, we're getting down to the wire here. So please drop it off at the shul tomorrow morning. I'm selling the Chametz at, I think, 11:30 with Rabbi Blau on Friday morning. So if that is your, I would say 11:20 will probably be the last time I check my phone. So please don't wait until the last minute. And I guess I know people have cleaning and cooking to do. And yes, you can email the form to me. Someone just put that in the chat. You can email the form to me if you have it. I'll print it out. That's definitely okay. So I know people have cooking and cleaning to do. Thanks everyone for taking the time to come together tonight. And I look forward to seeing all of you over Yom Tov.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care, everybody. Good to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.